He thought he was teaching an entitled old woman a lesson about the rules. A simple power play on a quiet Saturday afternoon in early October. Officer Kyle Brennan smirked as he wrenched the small dog from the trembling arms of the elderly black woman who had dared to question why he was harassing her outside a shopping plaza. The woman clutched her therapy animal tighter, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes, trying to explain that she had documentation. But Brennan didn't care about documentation. He cared about control. What Officer Brennan didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have known as he grabbed that woman's wrists and twisted them behind her back, was that the dignified woman in the brown blazer was Dorothy Chambers, retired elementary school principal, deacon at First Baptist Church, mother of Judge Michael Chambers, the youngest federal district judge in state history, a civil rights champion who had built his entire career prosecuting police misconduct cases. By the time Brennan realized his catastrophic mistake, the body cam footage was secured, the witnesses had recorded everything on their phones, and the price of his arrogance was set at $2.1 million. If you're loving this story of justice served and karma delivered, please hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss another tale of bullies getting exactly what they deserve. Now, let's see how this all unfolded. Dorothy Chambers had lived in Riverside for 43 years. She knew every street corner, every shop owner, every crossing guard. On that particular Saturday afternoon, she was doing what she did every weekend, carrying her small Shih Tzu therapy dog Muffin to the outdoor cafe at the Society Shopping Plaza where her book club met. Muffin, a 10-year-old brown and white bundle of fur, had been with Dorothy for 8 years, ever since her husband Thomas passed away. The dog wasn't just a pet. He was registered with the National Service Animal Registry as an emotional support animal, certified to help Dorothy manage the anxiety and grief that had threatened to swallow her whole after Thomas died. Dorothy walked slowly, the way someone does when their knees ache and their shoulders remember every year they've carried the weight of other people's children, other people's problems, other people's dreams. She wore her favorite brown blazer over a crisp white blouse, pearl earrings that had been her mother's, and comfortable walking shoes. Her gray hair was styled neatly, and despite being 68 years old, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of a woman who had spent decades commanding classrooms and earning respect. The plaza was busy that afternoon. Families streamed in and out of the shops, teenagers clustered around the juice bar, elderly couples sat on benches feeding the pigeons. Dorothy navigated through the crowd carefully, Muffin nestled securely in her arms. The little dog's heart condition meant he couldn't walk long distances, and Dorothy was always careful to keep him comfortable and safe. She was perhaps 50 feet from the cafe entrance when she heard the aggressive rev of an engine behind her. Officer Kyle Brennan's patrol car pulled up onto the pedestrian walkway, blocking her path. The door swung open and Brennan stepped out. He was 24 years old, blonde crew cut, broad shoulders that he used to intimidate, and a badge he wore like a weapon. He had graduated from the academy only 18 months ago, but already carried himself with the swagger of someone who believed the uniform made him untouchable. His grandfather had been police chief. His father had been a detective. Policing wasn't just his job, it was his identity. "Ma'am," Brennan called out, his voice carrying that particular tone of authority that expected immediate obedience. "You need to put that dog on a leash. City ordinance." Dorothy stopped, turning to face him with the patience of a woman who had spent 40 years dealing with difficult children. "Good afternoon, officer," she said, her voice warm despite her confusion. "This is Muffin. He's a certified therapy animal. I have his documentation right here in my purse." Brennan's jaw tightened. He hated when people talked back, when they offered explanations instead of immediate compliance. "I don't care what you think you have," he said, stepping closer. "City ordinance says all dogs must be leashed in public spaces. You're in violation." Dorothy's heart began to beat faster, but she kept her voice calm. She had lived through segregation, through the civil rights movement, through decades of small indignities and large injustices. She knew how to handle herself. "Officer, with respect, therapy animals are exempt from leash requirements under the Americans with Disabilities Act. If you'll just let me show you his certification." "Keep your hands where I can see them," Brennan barked, his hand moving instinctively toward his belt. Around them, people began to stop and stare. A young woman pulled out her phone, angling it toward the confrontation. An elderly man moved closer, concern etched on his face. Dorothy's hands, which had been reaching for her purse, froze in midair. Muffin whimpered, sensing his owner's tension. "Officer, I'm just trying to show you the paperwork," Dorothy said, her voice trembling now despite her efforts to stay calm. "I'm not doing anything wrong." "That's what they all say," Brennan muttered. He moved into Dorothy's personal space, using his height to loom over her. "Stop resisting and put the dog down. Now." "I'm not resisting," Dorothy protested, her teacher's voice coming through despite her fear. "Young man, you are making a terrible mistake. I live here. I've been coming to this plaza for 20 years. I'm not breaking any laws." But Brennan had already made his decision. In his mind, this was a simple equation. An old black woman had challenged his authority in public. She had tried to tell him he was wrong. She had dared to speak to him as if she had rights. That couldn't stand. Without warning, he reached out and grabbed Muffin from Dorothy's arms. The little dog yelped in terror as Brennan's large hands clamped around his small body. Dorothy instinctively reached for her pet, her maternal instincts overriding everything else. "Please, he has a heart condition. You're hurting him." Brennan interpreted her reaching hands as aggression. "That's it," he snarled. "You're under arrest for resisting an officer." He spun Dorothy around with enough force that she stumbled, her arthritis-weakened knees nearly giving out. The crowd gasped. Someone shouted, "She wasn't doing anything." Another voice, "She's an old lady. What are you doing?" But Brennan was beyond hearing. He slammed Dorothy against the hood of his patrol car, the metal hot under the afternoon sun. Dorothy cried out in pain as her shoulder, already damaged by years of arthritis, screamed in protest. "You're hurting me," she gasped. "Please, I haven't done anything wrong." "Stop resisting arrest," Brennan shouted for the benefit of his body camera, even though Dorothy's body was limp, her only movement, the involuntary trembling of shock and pain. He wrenched her arms behind her back and snapped handcuffs onto her wrists, tightening them until they bit into her delicate, age-spotted skin. Dorothy whimpered, tears streaming down her face. The crowd was shouting now, a dozen phones pointed at the scene. "This is police brutality. Someone call the news. She's a grandmother." But Brennan ignored them all. He opened the back door of his patrol car and roughly shoved Dorothy inside, her head nearly striking the doorframe. Then he took Muffin, who was still yelping in terror, and dropped him into the front seat, rolling up the windows. The temperature outside was 87 degrees. Inside the closed car, it would climb rapidly. Dorothy sat in the back of the patrol car, her wrists screaming in pain, her shoulder throbbing, her heart breaking as she listened to Muffin's distressed whimpering. Through the window, she could see the crowd. A young black woman with tears streaming down her face, an older white man shaking his head in disgust. A teenage boy recording everything, his face set in grim determination. And through all of it, Officer Kyle Brennan stood with his chest puffed out, speaking into his radio, reporting that he had just arrested a dangerous suspect for resisting arrest and violating city ordinances. What Brennan didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that every second of what he had just done was being captured from multiple angles. He didn't know that the young woman crying was a journalism student who had already sent the video to 3 news stations. He didn't know that the teenage boy was streaming live to 4,000 followers. And he definitely didn't know that in exactly 12 minutes, Dorothy Chambers would make a phone call that would change his life forever. 20 miles away, in the federal courthouse downtown, Judge Michael Chambers sat on the bench in his black robes, presiding over a preliminary hearing in a civil rights case. At 38 years old, Michael was the youngest person ever appointed to the federal district court in the state. He had earned his seat through a combination of brilliance, dedication, and an unwavering commitment to justice that had made him both beloved by civil rights advocates and feared by law enforcement agencies with something to hide. Michael had built his career on holding bad cops accountable. As a young attorney, he had worked for the ACLU, taking on case after case of police misconduct, winning settlement after settlement, changing policy after policy. His reputation was such that police unions lobbied against his judicial appointment, which only made the civil rights community fight harder for him. When he was finally confirmed, his first ruling was to strike down qualified immunity in a case involving excessive force against an unarmed teenager. The message was clear. In Michael Chambers' courtroom, the badge was not a shield for bad behavior. The hearing was routine, a dispute over discovery in a workplace discrimination case. Michael listened to the attorneys argue, asked pointed questions, and was about to rule when his bailiff, an older man named Frank who had worked in the courthouse for 30 years, approached the bench. Frank looked worried, which was unusual. Frank never looked worried. "Your Honor," Frank said quietly, leaning in so only Michael could hear. "I apologize for interrupting, but you have an urgent call in chambers. It's your mother." Michael's blood went cold. His mother never called him at work. Never. She understood the sanctity of the courtroom, the importance of his role. If she was calling now, during a hearing, something was terribly wrong. "Excuse me," Michael said to the attorneys, his voice steady despite the sudden hammering of his heart. "We'll take a 15-minute recess." He stood, his robes swirling around him, and walked quickly to his chambers, Frank following close behind. Michael's chambers were lined with law books, the walls decorated with photos of civil rights heroes. Thurgood Marshall, Constance Baker Motley, Pauli Murray. On his desk was a single framed photograph of his parents on their wedding day, his father in a sharp suit, his mother in a simple white dress, both of them young and beautiful and full of hope. Michael picked up the phone, his hand trembling slightly. "Mom?" The voice that came through the line was one he had never heard before. His mother, the woman who had raised him to be strong, to stand up for what was right, to never back down from injustice, was crying. Not the quiet tears of sadness, but the gasping sobs of someone in pain and shock and terror. "Michael," she choked out. "Michael, I need you. I've been arrested." The world seemed to tilt. Michael gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles white. "What? Mom, what are you talking about? Where are you?" Dorothy tried to steady her breathing, tried to find the words. "I'm at the Riverside Precinct. An officer, he arrested me. Michael, he hurt me. And Muffin, he took Muffin and put him in the car. And I think he's overheating. And I tried to explain about the therapy certification, but he wouldn't listen. And—" Her voice broke completely, dissolving into sobs. Michael's professional composure, the calm demeanor he maintained even in the most contentious hearings, shattered like glass. His mother was hurt. His mother was in a police station. His mother, who had never had so much as a parking ticket, who volunteered at the church food bank and tutored children for free, and had dedicated her entire life to helping others, had been arrested. "Which precinct?" he demanded, his voice hard as steel. "Mom, listen to me. Don't say another word to anyone. Do you understand?" "Not one word. I'm coming right now." "Michael, I'm scared," Dorothy whispered. "And Muffin—" "I'm going to fix this," Michael promised, his voice breaking for just a moment before the steel returned. "I swear to you, Mom, I'm going to fix this. Just hold on." He slammed the phone down and was already moving, ripping off his judicial robes to reveal the tailored suit underneath. Frank appeared in the doorway. "Judge Chambers, the attorneys are—" "Cancel the rest of my docket," Michael said, his voice cold and controlled. "Family emergency. And Frank, call Rebecca Torres at the ACLU. Tell her I need her at the Riverside Precinct immediately. Tell her to bring cameras." Michael burst out of the courthouse, still wearing his suit, his mind racing. His mother. They had arrested his mother. The woman who had worked 2 jobs to put him through college, who had sat in the front row of every courtroom appearance, who had cried tears of joy when he was appointed to the federal bench. Someone had put handcuffs on her. Someone had hurt her. And whoever that someone was, they were about to learn a lesson in consequences that they would never forget. He jumped into his black SUV and pulled out his phone while the engine roared to life. He scrolled through his contacts and hit a number he hadn't called in months. Rebecca Torres, his law school classmate, now one of the most feared civil rights attorneys in the state. She answered on the first ring. "Michael, what's wrong?" "Rebecca, my mother has been arrested at the Riverside Precinct. No details yet, but she's hurt and scared. I need you there with cameras. I need documentation of everything." There was a brief pause. Rebecca knew Michael's mother. She had eaten at Dorothy's table, had been welcomed into the Chambers home like family. "I'm on my way," she said, her voice tight with controlled fury. "Michael, don't do anything stupid. Let me handle the legal." "I'm not doing anything stupid." Michael interrupted, pulling into traffic with enough speed to make tires squeal. "I'm going to get my mother, and then I'm going to destroy whoever did this to her." At the Riverside Precinct, Dorothy sat in a holding cell, her wrists still throbbing from the too tight handcuffs. The cell was small and cold, with concrete walls painted industrial gray and a metal bench bolted to the floor. In the corner was an exposed toilet, a humiliation that made Dorothy's eyes burn with fresh tears. She had been strip-searched by a female officer who had been cold and efficient, treating Dorothy like a criminal rather than a human being. Her belongings had been confiscated: her purse, her reading glasses, the book club schedule she kept folded in her pocket, and the photograph of Thomas she always carried. His smiling face creased from years of being held close to her heart. The booking process had been deliberately humiliating. The desk sergeant, a jaded man in his 50s with cold eyes and a beer gut straining against his uniform, had processed her paperwork with theatrical slowness. When Dorothy asked again about Muffin, whether someone could check on her dog, whether someone could at least crack a window, the sergeant had laughed. "Lady, you should have thought about your dog before you decided to assault an officer." "I didn't assault anyone," Dorothy had protested weakly, her voice hoarse from crying. "I just reached for my dog." "That's not what Officer Brennan's report says," the sergeant replied, sliding the arrest report across the counter for her to see. Dorothy's eyes, already blurry with tears, struggled to focus on the words, but even through her distress, she could see that the report bore no resemblance to reality. According to Brennan's account, Dorothy had been verbally aggressive and physically threatening, had refused multiple lawful orders, and had struck the officer in the chest when he attempted to secure the animal. Every word was a lie. Now, sitting alone in the cell, Dorothy tried to steady her breathing. She closed her eyes and thought of Michael, her son, her pride and joy. The boy who had been born with a sense of justice so strong it seemed written into his DNA. She thought of the time when Michael was 7 years old and had punched a boy twice his size for bullying a classmate. She had been called to the principal's office, expecting to have to defend her son, only to find the other boy's mother already there, apologizing because her son had been tormenting a smaller child for weeks. Michael had come home with a black eye and a detention, but his head held high. "Mom," he had said that night, his young voice fierce, "sometimes you have to stand up, even when it costs you." Dorothy had kissed his forehead and told him he was right, even as she worried about what the world would do to a black boy who refused to back down. But Michael had grown up into a man who still believed in standing up, who had built his entire career on the principle that no one was above the law. And now, Dorothy realized with a mixture of pride and fear, her son was about to go to war for her. The cell door clanged open, startling Dorothy from her thoughts. A young woman was pushed inside, stumbling slightly before catching herself. She was 19 or 20, with her hair pulled back in a ponytail, wearing jeans and a hoodie, her eyes red from crying. The door slammed shut again, and the two women stood looking at each other in the harsh fluorescent light. "Miss Dorothy?" the young woman said suddenly, her voice filled with disbelief. "Miss Chambers, is that you?" Dorothy squinted, trying to place the face, and then recognition dawned. "Keisha? Keisha Washington?" The young woman nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "You were my 4th-grade teacher. You taught me to read when everyone else said I couldn't." Dorothy's heart broke a little more. Keisha had been one of hers, one of the struggling readers that Dorothy had spent extra hours with, staying late after school, bringing in special books, refusing to give up even when Keisha's own family had written her off as learning disabled. By the end of 4th grade, Keisha had been reading at grade level. By 6th grade, she was ahead. "Sweetheart," Dorothy said softly, moving to embrace the young woman. "What are you doing here?" Keisha returned the embrace, sobbing into Dorothy's shoulder. "I had some unpaid parking tickets," she said. "I was walking home from work and an officer stopped me, ran my name, and arrested me. Miss Dorothy, I was just walking home." "Which officer?" Dorothy asked, though she already knew the answer. "Brennan," Keisha whispered. "Officer Brennan. He said I was in a high-crime area and looked suspicious, but I live here. I was just walking home from my job at the grocery store." She pulled back, looking at Dorothy's bruised wrists, her torn blazer, her swollen eyes. "Miss Dorothy, what happened to you?" Dorothy told her, the words coming out in a rush. The dog, the plaza, the violent arrest, Brennan's refusal to listen. As she spoke, Keisha's face transformed from sympathy to recognition to anger. "He does this," Keisha said. "Miss Dorothy, everyone in the neighborhood knows. Officer Brennan targets us. Last month, he arrested Mr. Washington for trespassing, and Mr. Washington was literally standing in his own front yard. 2 weeks ago, he cited Mrs. Martinez for loitering, and she was waiting at the bus stop. Dorothy felt something shift inside her. This wasn't just about her. This wasn't an isolated incident, a single bad decision by a young officer having a bad day. This was a pattern. This was systematic. This was exactly what Michael had spent his career fighting against. "Keisha," Dorothy said, her teacher's voice returning, steady and sure. "Listen to me carefully. Don't say anything to anyone else. Not the guards, not the other officers, not anyone. When they come to question you, you say only one thing. I want my lawyer. Do you understand?" Keisha nodded, wiping her eyes. "But Miss Dorothy, I can't afford a lawyer. My mom can barely afford." "You're going to have a lawyer," Dorothy interrupted. "The best one, I promise you. My son is a federal judge, and he's on his way here right now. And sweetheart, when Michael gets here, everything is going to change." There was a wall phone in the cell, the kind that only allowed collect calls. Dorothy moved to it, picked up the receiver, and dialed the number Michael had given her years ago, a direct line that bypassed the normal channels. The phone rang twice before a recording asked her to state her name for the collect call. "Dorothy Chambers," she said clearly. "For Michael Chambers." The line clicked, and then Michael's voice came through, tight with barely controlled emotion. "Mom, are you okay?" "I'm not okay," Dorothy said honestly. "But I will be. Michael, there's a young woman here with me, Keisha Washington. She was my student. She's also been arrested by the same officer. This isn't random, Michael. This is a pattern." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Michael spoke again, his voice was cold and hard and utterly without mercy. "Mom, I'm pulling into the parking lot right now. Rebecca is right behind me. Don't say anything else. We're getting you out." Dorothy hung up the phone and turned to Keisha, who was watching her with wide, hopeful eyes. "What happens now?" Keisha asked. Dorothy managed a small smile, the first real expression of hope she had felt since this nightmare began. "Now," she said softly, "justice happens. Because my son doesn't just know the law. He is the law. And he's about to remind everyone in this building what that means." Outside the precinct, a black SUV pulled into the parking lot with a screech of tires. Judge Michael Chambers emerged, still wearing his suit from court, his face set in an expression that made people instinctively step back. He had removed his judicial robes, but the authority they represented clung to him like armor. Behind him, a second car pulled up, and Rebecca Torres stepped out, flanked by a legal assistant carrying a professional camera and a briefcase thick with legal documents. We're halfway through this incredible story of justice and accountability, and if you're as invested as I am in seeing how this unfolds, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss another story where karma catches up with those who abuse their power. Michael and Rebecca strode toward the precinct entrance like an army of two. Michael's jaw was clenched so tight that Rebecca worried he might crack a tooth. She had seen him angry before, had watched him eviscerate corrupt police officers on the witness stand, with nothing but words and facts. But she had never seen him like this. This was personal. This was primal. This was a son going to war for his mother. They pushed through the precinct doors. The lobby was busy with the usual Saturday chaos. People waiting to file reports, officers coming and going, phones ringing. But the moment Michael Chambers walked in, the chaos seemed to pause. Conversations died mid-sentence. Officers turned to stare, because everyone in the Riverside precinct knew Judge Michael Chambers. They knew him because he had ruled against their department in 7 different cases. They knew him because 3 of their colleagues were currently serving time because of convictions in his courtroom. They knew him because when Michael Chambers appeared, it meant someone was about to pay for their sins. The desk sergeant, the same man who had laughed at Dorothy's pleas about her dog, looked up from his paperwork and felt his stomach drop. "Judge Chambers," he said, trying to sound official and failing miserably. "Can I help you with something?" Michael's voice, when he spoke, was so cold it could have frozen the sun. "I am Federal District Judge Michael Chambers. You are currently holding my mother, Dorothy Chambers, on fraudulent charges. I want her released immediately, and I want the name of the arresting officer." The precinct had gone absolutely silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Officers froze in mid-step. Civilians stopped their conversations. Even the phones seemed to stop ringing. The desk sergeant's face drained of all color. Your mother?" Judge Chambers' eye. "There must be some mistake." "The only mistake," Michael said, his voice rising now, no longer cold but burning with fury, was made by whoever put their hands on my mother. Rebecca, are you recording this? Rebecca stepped forward, her legal assistant already filming. Everything, Michael, every word, every face. The sergeant stammered. Sir, I need to get the watch commander. You have 30 seconds, Michael interrupted, to produce my mother, or I start making phone calls. The first call is to the mayor, who owes me 3 favors. The second call is to the FBI Civil Rights Division, who I worked with for 8 years. The third call is to every news station in the state. You want to guess which one I make first? The sergeant grabbed his radio, his hands shaking. Commander Ellis, we need you at the front desk immediately. It's urgent. From the back of the precinct, Officer Kyle Brennan emerged, holding a cup of coffee, laughing at something another officer had said. He was in a good mood. The arrest had been textbook, his report was filed, and he was already thinking about the gym later that evening. He glanced toward the front desk and froze. Standing there, in an expensive suit, with eyes that could cut through steel, was a man Brennan recognized from the newspapers, Judge Michael Chambers. The coffee cup slipped from Brennan's hand, shattering on the floor, the hot liquid splashing across his boots, but he didn't notice. He was too busy connecting dots that he desperately wished would remain unconnected. The woman he had arrested, elderly black woman, Chambers, Dorothy Chambers. His eyes went wide with the sudden, terrible realization of what he had done. Michael's gaze swung around and locked onto Brennan like a missile targeting system. You, Michael said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. You're Officer Brennan. It wasn't a question. Michael had already pulled up Brennan's file on his phone during the drive over. 8 complaints in 18 months, all dismissed, all involving people of color, all cleared by the same training officer. Michael had memorized every word of every complaint, and now he was staring at the man who had put his hands on his mother. Brennan's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Judge Chambers, I didn't. She was violating city ordinance, and when I tried to secure the animal, she became aggressive, and I had to— Stop talking, Rebecca Torres interrupted, stepping between Michael and Brennan before her friend did something that would end his career. Officer Brennan, I'm attorney Rebecca Torres with the ACLU. We have 3 witness videos of the incident. Your body camera footage, which we will be subpoenaing, shows you lied in every detail of your report. Where is Mrs. Chambers? The watch commander, a gray-haired man named Ellis, who had been with the department for 30 years and had seen every kind of disaster imaginable, came running down the hallway. He took one look at the scene, Michael Chambers standing in his precinct like an avenging angel, Rebecca Torres with her camera crew, Officer Brennan looking like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole, and Ellis knew with absolute certainty that his career had just taken a catastrophic turn. Judge Chambers, Ellis said, trying to sound calm and authoritative. I'm sure we can resolve this situation. There's obviously been some kind of misunderstanding. There has been no misunderstanding, Michael said, each word precise as a scalpel cut. Your officer assaulted my 68-year-old mother over a therapy dog. He lied in his report. He used excessive force on an elderly woman who posed zero threat. And according to the witnesses I've already spoken to, he locked her dog in a hot car. So here's what's going to happen, Commander Ellis. You're going to bring my mother out of whatever cell you've thrown her in. You're going to do it in the next 60 seconds. And then you're going to stand there while I decide whether to charge every person in this building with false imprisonment or whether I'm going to be merciful and only destroy Officer Brennan's life. Ellis swallowed hard. He had 2 choices: cooperate and maybe salvage something from this disaster, or fight and guarantee that the entire department went down in flames. It wasn't really a choice at all. Sergeant, release Mrs. Chambers immediately, and somebody better check on that dog. Now. Officers scrambled. Brennan stood frozen, watching his career evaporate in real time. Michael stood in the center of the precinct like a statue of vengeance, waiting. Rebecca stood beside him, camera rolling, documenting everything, and somewhere in the back of the building, a cell door clanged open. Dorothy Chambers was brought out, escorted by a female officer who looked ashamed to even be part of this situation. And when Michael saw his mother, when he saw the bruises on her wrists, the tear in her blazer, the swelling around her shoulder, the devastation in her eyes, something inside him broke and then reforged itself into something harder and more determined than it had ever been before. Mom, Michael said, his voice cracking for just a moment before he got it under control. He moved toward her, and Dorothy stumbled into her son's arms, finally allowing herself to completely break down. She sobbed into his chest, her whole body shaking, while Michael held her and whispered promises that he would make this right, that he would fix this, that no one would ever hurt her again. Rebecca watched with tears in her own eyes. She had seen a lot of injustice in her career, had represented countless victims of police brutality, but something about seeing Dorothy Chambers, this dignified woman who had dedicated her life to children and community, reduced to this trembling, traumatized victim, lit a fire in Rebecca's chest that would not be extinguished until every person responsible had paid in full. Michael pulled back slightly, still supporting his mother, and examined her injuries with a prosecutor's eye. "Did he do this to you?" Michael asked, looking at her wrists. Dorothy nodded, unable to speak. Michael turned to Commander Ellis, his face a mask of controlled fury. "I want Officer Brennan's personnel file. Every complaint, every use of force report, every disciplinary action. I want it now. Judge Chambers, those files are confidential." "I will have a federal subpoena on your desk in exactly 2 hours," Michael interrupted. "And, Commander, let me be very clear about something. This is not a request. This is not a negotiation. This is me telling you that you can voluntarily comply right now, or you can fight me in court and lose, and then face additional charges for obstruction. Your choice. You have 10 seconds. Ellis knew when he was beaten. "Get me Brennan's file," he ordered the desk sergeant. Then he turned to Michael, trying one last time to salvage something. "Judge Chambers, I assure you that we take all complaints seriously. If Officer Brennan overstepped—" "If?" Dorothy's voice cut through the room like a knife. Everyone turned to look at her. She had stopped crying, her teacher's spine straightening, her voice finding its strength again. "Commander Ellis, there is no if. Your officer assaulted me without cause. He lied in his report, and he left my dog to die in a hot car. That's not an if, that's a certainty." At that moment, another officer rushed in carrying Muffin. The little dog was panting heavily, his tongue hanging out, his eyes unfocused. Dorothy cried out and reached for him, cradling him against her chest. "Get him water," Michael commanded. "Now, and call a veterinarian. If anything happens to this dog—" But Muffin was already drinking from the bowl of water. Someone thrust forward, his little body slowly calming as Dorothy held him and whispered reassurances. The dog was dehydrated and traumatized, but he would live. That was more than could be said for Officer Brennan's career. Keisha Washington was brought out next, still in handcuffs. Dorothy immediately stepped forward. "Michael, this is Keisha. She was one of my students. She was arrested by the same officer." Michael looked at the young woman, saw the fear and hope warring in her eyes, and made a decision that took exactly 3 seconds. "Rebecca, she's ours too. Pro bono." Rebecca nodded. "Keisha, I'm Rebecca Torres, and you're now officially represented by the ACLU. Don't say another word to anyone without me present. Understand?" Keisha nodded, tears of relief streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you so much." Officer Brennan, watching all of this unfold, felt his life collapsing around him. His training officer, Sergeant Rick Dalton, had taught him that arrests like these were safe. Elderly people, minority communities, people without resources, they never fought back. They couldn't afford lawyers. They couldn't challenge the system. Dalton had told him that the key was confidence and the proper paperwork. "Make your report airtight," Dalton had said, "and they can't touch you." But Dalton had never prepared him for this. Dalton had never warned him about what happened when you arrested the mother of a federal judge. And now, as Brennan watched Michael Chambers demand files and threaten lawsuits and make promises of accountability, Brennan realized that everything Sergeant Dalton had taught him was about to be exposed as a lie. Michael turned to face Brennan one last time before leaving with his mother. "Officer Brennan," Michael said, his voice soft now but somehow more terrifying than when he had been shouting. "You picked the wrong family. My mother is going home, she's going to recover. But you, I'm going to personally review every arrest you've ever made. I'm going to find every person you've abused. And I'm going to make sure you never wear that badge again." That's not a threat, that's a promise. Brennan had no response. What could he say? He had rolled the dice on a power trip and come up snake eyes. As Michael escorted his mother toward the door, Rebecca, gathering evidence and witnesses, Brennan was left standing in the precinct, his fellow officers avoiding his gaze, his watch commander already on the phone with the city attorney, his future reduced to rubble in less than 20 minutes. Commander Ellis made one last attempt. "Judge Chambers, I'll have someone drive Mrs. Chambers home." "No one from this department," Michael said coldly, "is ever going near my mother again." And with that, they were gone. Michael helped his mother into his SUV. Rebecca followed in her car with Keisha and the witnesses, and the Riverside precinct was left to contemplate the disaster that had just walked through their doors. That night, in Michael's home office, the war room was established. Rebecca Torres arrived with 2 junior associates and enough legal documents to fill a truck. Michael's home was a mixture of comfortable warmth and professional efficiency. The kitchen, where Dorothy used to cook Sunday dinners for Michael and his friends, now served coffee and takeout food for a team of lawyers working through the night. The dining room table was covered in file folders. Laptop computers glowed in every corner. Dorothy was upstairs, resting. Michael had insisted she see a doctor who had treated her shoulder strain, documented her bruises, and prescribed pain medication and rest. Muffin was curled up beside her on the guest room bed, both of them finally safe, finally home. But Dorothy couldn't sleep. Downstairs, she could hear her son and his team working, and she knew that what they were building was bigger than just her case. In the office, Michael and Rebecca reviewed Officer Brennan's file, and what they found was damning. 8 complaints in 18 months. All of them involved minority residents. All of them followed the same pattern. Brennan would find some minor violation, escalate the situation, arrest the person when they protested, and then file a report that painted himself as the victim of aggression. And every single time, the complaint had been investigated and cleared by Sergeant Rick Dalton, Brennan's training officer. "Michael, look at this," Rebecca said, pointing at her laptop screen. She had cross-referenced Brennan's GPS data from his patrol car with arrest records. Every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, Brennan parks in the same spot for 2 to 3 hours. And look what happens within an hour of him leaving that spot. Michael leaned over to look. The pattern was clear. After these mysterious parking sessions, Brennan would make arrests. Always minor offenses. Always in predominantly black neighborhoods. Always people who were elderly or young or vulnerable in some way. "What's at that location?" Michael asked. Rebecca pulled up a map. "It's a bar called the Bronze Shield. Want to bet what kind of bar it is?" "Cop bar," Michael said grimly. "And want to bet who else frequents it?" Rebecca was already searching. Within minutes, she had her answer. "Sergeant Rick Dalton. According to social media posts and credit card records we can subpoena, Dalton is at the Bronze Shield every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon." "And Michael, look at this." She pulled up a private Facebook group called Street Smart Policing. The group was closed, but Rebecca had gotten access through a friendly officer she had worked with before. It's run by Dalton. He calls them training sessions. He's teaching young officers how to make arrests stick, how to justify force, how to target vulnerable populations who won't fight back. Michael felt his blood pressure rising. This wasn't just one bad cop. This was institutional. This was a culture of abuse being actively cultivated by a training officer who had found a way to weaponize the badge. "Can you get into that group more thoroughly?" "I'll need a subpoena," Rebecca said. "But yes." "You'll have one by tomorrow morning," Michael promised. He picked up his phone and called Judge Patricia Owens, a colleague he trusted implicitly. Even though it was 11 o'clock at night, she answered. "Patricia, it's Michael. I need an emergency warrant." Judge Owens listened as Michael explained the situation, and within an hour, Rebecca had her subpoena. By 3 o'clock in the morning, Dalton's computer hard drive was being imaged by forensic specialists. By 5 o'clock in the morning, they had what they needed. The document was called Street Smart Policing, a tactical guide. It was 70 pages of pure corruption. Dalton had systematically documented how to profile, how to escalate, how to manufacture probable cause, how to write reports that would withstand scrutiny. There were sections on targeting the elderly because they were physically weak and unlikely to sue, sections on using minor ordinances to harass specific communities, sections on how to cover up mistakes and protect yourself from complaints. It was a blueprint for systematic abuse, and Dalton had been teaching it to young officers for at least 5 years. Michael read through it, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. Rebecca sat beside him, equally horrified. "This is evidence of conspiracy," she said. This is Rico territory. Michael, we can't just go after Brennan. We have to go after Dalton and everyone he trained. I know, Michael said. Pull the records. Every officer who has attended one of Dalton's training sessions. Every arrest they've made in the past 5 years. Cross-reference for patterns. Rebecca's team worked through the night. By sunrise, they had identified 12 officers trained by Dalton and a pattern of over 200 arrests that followed the same playbook. The evidence was overwhelming. This wasn't about one officer having a bad day. This was a criminal enterprise operating under the color of law. Dorothy came downstairs around 7 o'clock in the morning, moving slowly, Muffin in her arms. She found her son at the dining room table, surrounded by papers, his eyes red from lack of sleep, his coffee cold and forgotten. "Michael," she said softly, "have you slept at all?" He looked up at her, and his expression broke her heart. He looked like he had when he was a little boy and had just discovered that the world wasn't fair. "Mom, it's worse than we thought. Brennan wasn't acting alone. He was trained to do this, and he's not the only one." Dorothy set Muffin down and moved to stand behind her son, placing her hands on his shoulders. "Then we stopped them," she said simply. "Not just Brennan, all of them." Michael reached up and covered her hands with his own. "Mom, this is going to get ugly. They're going to come after you. They're going to try to discredit you, attack your reputation, make you out to be the problem." "Let them try," Dorothy said, her voice steel underneath the gentleness. "I taught school for 40 years, Michael. I've dealt with bullies before. And I've never backed down from a fight when the cause was righteous." Rebecca emerged from the office, looking exhausted but energized. "We have enough for the lawsuit," she said. "Civil rights violations, false imprisonment, assault, intentional infliction of emotional distress. And Michael, I think we can make the case for municipal liability. The city knew about Dalton's training methods. They had to. No one gets this many complaints cleared without higher-ups knowing." "File it," Michael said. "Name Brennan, name Dalton, name the department, and name the city." "What are we asking for?" Rebecca asked. Dorothy spoke before Michael could. "Enough to make them remember. Enough that they think twice before they hurt someone else's mother." Michael smiled at her, fierce and proud. $2.1 million, he said. $1 million for compensatory damages, $1.1 million for punitive damages. That's $10,000 for every complaint against Brennan that the department ignored, plus $100,000 for every year my mother has left on this earth, if statistics are kind. Rebecca nodded. "I'll have the complaint filed by noon." But Michael wasn't done. He picked up his phone again and made another call, this time to the FBI's Civil Rights Division. Special Agent Marcus Wright answered on the second ring. Michael had worked with Wright years ago on a racketeering case involving corrupt police officers in another jurisdiction. "Marcus, it's Michael Chambers. I'm sending you something that's going to ruin your weekend." 48 hours later, the story broke. The news wasn't just local anymore. National media picked it up. Judge's mother arrested. Police training manual exposes systematic abuse. Federal investigation launched. The headlines screamed across every platform. The witness videos from the plaza had gone viral, racking up millions of views. The hashtag Justice for Miss Chambers was trending. Dorothy's former students flooded social media with testimonials about her character, her kindness, her decades of service to the community. But the city of Riverside didn't go down quietly. The mayor's office, in coordination with the police union, launched a counteroffensive. They held a press conference where they suggested that Dorothy had weaponized her son's position, that she had been belligerent and difficult, that Officer Brennan had been following proper procedures. They released a statement questioning whether Muffin was really a therapy dog or just a pet that Dorothy was pretending had certification. The smear campaign was coordinated and vicious. Anonymous sources told reporters that Dorothy had a history of filing complaints against the police department. Articles appeared suggesting that Michael was using his judicial position inappropriately to pressure the department. The police union president went on television and painted Brennan as a good officer who had been thrown under the bus to satisfy political correctness. Dorothy watched the news coverage from Michael's living room, Muffin on her lap, and felt the weight of their attacks. It's one thing to know intellectually that people will try to destroy your character. It's another thing to watch it happen in real time, to see your face on television with commentary suggesting you're a liar and a manipulator. Michael sat beside her, his arm around her shoulders, saying nothing because there was nothing to say. Rebecca had warned them this would happen. This was always what happened when you challenged power. But then something unexpected occurred. The smear campaign backfired spectacularly. Dorothy's church held a press conference, 50 members strong, all testifying to her character. The principal of the elementary school where she had taught for 40 years released her personnel file, showing commendations and awards and grateful letters from parents. Former students, now adults with careers and families of their own, recorded video testimonials. Teachers she had mentored came forward. Community leaders spoke out. A woman named Martha Johnson, 83 years old, appeared on the local news and told her story. She had been cited by Officer Brennan for loitering at a bus stop. She had been waiting for the bus to take her to her dialysis appointment. Brennan had told her she looked suspicious and demanded identification. When she had protested, he had written her a citation that cost her $200 she couldn't afford. She had paid it because she was scared, because she didn't think anyone would believe her over a police officer, because she thought that was just how the world worked. But now, seeing Dorothy Chambers fight back, seeing a federal judge take up his mother's cause, Martha Johnson found her courage, and she wasn't alone. One by one, other victims came forward. A young man who had been arrested for trespassing while sitting on his own front porch. A grandmother who had been stopped and searched while walking to church. A teenager who had been tackled and handcuffed for jaywalking in a crosswalk. All of them victims of officers trained by Sergeant Rick Dalton. All of them too scared, or too poor, or too tired to fight until now. The tide turned. The mayor, seeing the political calculus shift, suddenly became very interested in police reform. The city attorney, reviewing the mounting evidence and the potential liability, started making calls about settlement. And Officer Kyle Brennan, watching his life implode from his living room, where he sat alone because his wife had taken their children and moved in with her mother, realized that Sergeant Dalton wasn't returning his calls. Brennan tried to reach his training officer, the man who had promised to have his back, the man who had taught him that this was how you did the job. But Dalton had gone silent. The union lawyer was telling Brennan to keep his mouth shut and take the fall alone. The department was putting out statements distancing themselves from his actions, calling him a rogue actor. And Brennan, sitting in his empty apartment, looking at the video of himself yanking a small dog from an old woman's arms, playing on repeat on every news channel, finally understood that he was the sacrifice. It was a Tuesday night, 2 weeks after Dorothy's arrest, when Brennan's phone rang at 11:45. The number was blocked. Brennan, half drunk and desperate, answered, "What?" "Officer Brennan?" The voice was female, professional, cold. "This is Attorney Rebecca Torres. I'm calling because I think we should talk." "I have a lawyer," Brennan slurred. "Union lawyer." "Yes. And how's that working out for you?" Rebecca asked. "Because from where I'm sitting, you're about to take the fall for everything while Sergeant Dalton retires with his pension intact and the city walks away with a slap on the wrist. That seem fair to you?" Brennan said nothing, but his silence was answer enough. "I have evidence," Rebecca continued, "that Dalton has been running an illegal training program for 5 years. I have his manual. I have financial records showing he was getting kickbacks from the police union for every officer he radicalized. I have GPS data showing that dozens of arrests came directly after Dalton's training sessions. And Officer Brennan, I have testimony from other officers about what Dalton taught you." "What do you want?" Brennan asked, his voice hollow. "I want the truth," Rebecca said simply. "And I think you might want to tell it before you go down for crimes that someone else orchestrated." There was a long pause. Then Brennan said, "I can't. They'll destroy me." "They're already destroying you," Rebecca pointed out. "But if you cooperate, if you testify about Dalton's training methods and who knew about them, I might be able to negotiate some leniency. You're still going to lose your badge, and you're still going to face consequences, but you don't have to be the only one." Another pause. Then, quietly, "Where do we meet?" Rebecca gave him an address. 2 hours later, in a conference room at the FBI field office, Officer Kyle Brennan began to talk. He talked about Dalton's training sessions at the Bronze Shield Bar. He talked about the documents, the tactics, the encouragement to target vulnerable populations. He talked about how Dalton had explicitly taught them to profile elderly residents because they were less likely to have video evidence and less likely to sue. He talked about the culture of covering for each other, of clearing complaints, of protecting the brotherhood. And most damning of all, Brennan revealed that Dalton's training wasn't just tolerated by the department, it was funded. The police union was paying Dalton $500 per session to train officers in proactive policing techniques. The training was unofficial but widespread, and at least 3 command staff officers had attended sessions. The corruption went all the way up. Special Agent Marcus Wright recorded every word. When Brennan finally finished, it was 4 o'clock in the morning. He looked 10 years older, his face haggard, his eyes empty. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now," Rebecca said, "you sign a formal statement, and then you pray that the judge shows you more mercy than you showed Mrs. Chambers." As we're coming to the final part of this incredible story, if you believe in accountability and justice, please hit that like button and share this video. Make sure you subscribe so you can see how this battle between a mother's dignity and a broken system finally ends. The preliminary hearing was set for 3 weeks later. Judge Patricia Owens would preside, Michael having recused himself to avoid any appearance of impropriety. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled, reporters crammed in the back row, cameras set up outside the courthouse. Dorothy Chambers arrived dressed in her best suit, Muffin's therapy certification papers in her purse, Michael on one side and Rebecca on the other. Officer Kyle Brennan arrived in handcuffs. After his statement to the FBI, he had been arrested on charges of assault, filing false reports, and conspiracy. His bail had been set at $50,000, and his wife had refused to put up their house. He was wearing an orange jumpsuit instead of his uniform, and the transformation was complete. The man who had been so confident in his power 2 weeks ago now shuffled into the courtroom like a ghost. Sergeant Rick Dalton arrived with his lawyer in an attitude of defiance. He was 52 years old, a 28-year veteran of the force, and he had no intention of going down without a fight. He believed, right up until the hearing started, that his connections would save him. Judge Owens called the court to order. "We're here today on preliminary matters in the case of Chambers versus City of Riverside and related criminal proceedings. Let's begin with the civil matter. Attorney Torres, you may proceed." Rebecca stood, and what followed was 3 hours of devastating evidence. She played the body camera footage from Brennan's arrest of Dorothy, footage that showed clearly that Dorothy had never been aggressive, never resisted, never did anything to warrant the force used against her. She played witness videos from multiple angles. She had Dorothy's doctor testify about her injuries. She had a veterinarian testify about Muffin's heat stress and dehydration. And then Rebecca introduced Dalton's training manual into evidence. The courtroom gasped as she read sections aloud. Instructions on how to manufacture probable cause. Suggestions to target the elderly because they won't fight back physically and rarely have the resources for legal action. Explicit discussions of how to write reports that would withstand scrutiny, even if the arrest was questionable. The city's attorney, a nervous man named Richard Bloom, tried to object, tried to argue that the training manual was irrelevant to Dorothy's case. But Judge Owens shut him down. "This manual directly relates to the conduct that led to Mrs. Chambers' arrest," she said. "It establishes a pattern and practice. I'll allow it." Rebecca then called Keisha Washington to the stand. Keisha, wearing a borrowed suit, told her story of being arrested for walking home from work. Then Rebecca called Martha Johnson, who told of being cited for waiting at a bus stop. Then came 3 more victims, all elderly, all black, all targeted by officers trained by Dalton. By the time Rebecca rested her case, the pattern was undeniable. This wasn't isolated. This wasn't a mistake. This was systematic abuse of power, cultivated and encouraged by a training officer, and ignored by a department that valued arrests over justice. The city tried to mount a defense. They argued that Dalton's training had been unauthorized, that the department had no knowledge of his manual, that Brennan had acted alone. But then Rebecca produced her nuclear weapon, financial records showing that the police union had been paying Dalton for training sessions, and attendance records showing that 3 command staff officers, including the deputy chief, had been present at these sessions. The deputy chief was called to testify. He tried to claim he didn't remember what was taught. Rebecca showed him emails where he had praised Dalton's effective tactics. He tried to claim the manual was just a draft, never implemented. Rebecca showed him arrest records that followed the manual's playbook exactly. By the end of the second day, the city's defense was in ruins. The mayor, watching from his office via live stream, called an emergency meeting with the city attorney. "Settle he ordered. "Settle now before the FBI files federal charges against everyone." On the third day of the hearing, before Judge Owens could even call the court to order, Richard Bloom stood up. "Your Honor, the city would like to request a recess to discuss settlement." Michael, sitting in the gallery beside his mother, squeezed her hand. Dorothy sat perfectly still, her back straight, muffin on her lap, and watched as the system that had tried to break her finally acknowledged its wrongs. The settlement negotiations took exactly 2 hours. The city offered $500,000. Rebecca laughed in their faces and walked out. They came back with $1 million. Rebecca countered with $3 million. They settled at $2.1 million, plus a comprehensive consent decree that would place the entire police department under federal oversight for 5 years. Additionally, the city agreed to terminate Officer Kyle Brennan immediately, force Sergeant Rick Dalton into retirement and strip his pension, conduct an independent investigation into all officers trained by Dalton, implement mandatory de-escalation training, create a civilian oversight board with real authority, establish a victims' compensation fund for anyone who could prove they were targeted using Dalton's tactics. Dorothy Chambers sat in the settlement conference room and listened to the terms. When they finished, she looked at Michael and Rebecca, and then she spoke for the first time in hours. "I want one more thing," she said quietly. "Mom, we got everything," Michael protested gently. $2.1 million, all the reforms." "I want to chair the Civilian Oversight Board," Dorothy interrupted. "I want to be the one who reviews complaints. I want to be the one who holds them accountable going forward. Because I don't want money for myself. I want this to mean something." Richard Bloom looked like he wanted to object, but he was in no position to negotiate. "The mayor will have to approve." "The mayor will approve," Rebecca said with finality, "or we reject the settlement and see you in federal court for the next 3 years. Your choice." The city approved. 6 months later, Dorothy Chambers stood in city council chambers, wearing her pearls and her best dress, muffin at her feet. She was being sworn in as the chair of the newly formed Riverside Citizen Police Oversight Board. The chambers were packed with community members, former students, and supporters. Michael sat in the front row, pride radiating from his face. Rebecca sat beside him, already working on the next case, the next fight. Dorothy took her oath of office and then addressed the room. "I stand before you today, not as a victim," she said, her teacher's voice carrying to every corner, "but as a testament to what happens when ordinary people refuse to be silent. When that officer arrested me, he thought he was exerting power over someone powerless. He was wrong. Because I had something he didn't anticipate, a son who believes in justice, friends who believe in community, and a faith that believes in accountability." She paused, looking out at the faces. Some were crying, some were smiling, all were listening. "This board will be fair," Dorothy continued. "We will investigate every complaint with the seriousness it deserves. We will protect good officers who serve with honor, and we will remove bad officers who abuse their power. Because the badge is not a shield for wrongdoing. It's a symbol of service. And service means protecting everyone, especially those who cannot protect themselves." The applause was thunderous. Officer Kyle Brennan, meanwhile, was in a very different place. His criminal trial had resulted in a conviction on 3 counts: assault, filing false reports, and conspiracy. He was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison. His wife had divorced him. His father, the retired detective, had disowned him. And on his first day in prison, wearing the same orange jumpsuit he had worn to court, Brennan learned what it felt like to be powerless. Sergeant Rick Dalton fared even worse. The FBI investigation uncovered evidence of financial crimes as well. He had been skimming from the police union payments, creating fake training sessions and pocketing the money. He was charged with fraud, racketeering, and conspiracy. His trial was scheduled for the following year, but the evidence was overwhelming. His lawyer was already negotiating a plea deal that would put him away for at least 10 years. The deputy chief and 2 other command staff officers were forced to resign. The police chief himself barely survived, keeping his job only after agreeing to implement every single reform the consent decree required. The Riverside Police Department, once a bastion of unchecked power, was transformed into a model of accountability. 1 year after her arrest, Dorothy Chambers returned to the Society Shopping Plaza. It was a Saturday afternoon, just like that day. She was carrying muffin, just like that day. But everything else was different. She walked to the outdoor cafe where her book club met, and her friends greeted her with hugs and tears and laughter. They settled at their usual table, 5 elderly women with their books and their small dogs and their stories. Dorothy ordered her usual coffee and pulled out her book. Muffin curled up at her feet, his therapy dog vest clearly visible, though no one challenged them anymore. As she was settling in to read, Dorothy noticed a figure approaching. She tensed automatically, that trauma response she was still working through with her therapist. But then, she saw the face. It was a young police officer, perhaps 22 years old, with kind eyes and a nervous expression. The officer's name tag read Reyes. Officer Jennifer Reyes stopped a respectful distance from the table and removed her cap. "Mrs. Chambers?" she said quietly. "I'm Officer Reyes. I just graduated from the academy. They made us study your case as part of our training." Dorothy's heart, which had begun to race with old fear, slowed. "They did?" "Yes, ma'am," Officer Reyes nodded. "They taught us about de-escalation, about respecting community members, about how the badge doesn't make us better than anyone else. They taught us about what happens when officers forget they're there to serve. And Mrs. Chambers, I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for what happened to you. And I wanted to say thank you. Because of you, we're being trained differently. We're being taught to be better." Dorothy felt tears prick her eyes. She stood up, slowly because of her knees, but with all the grace she possessed, and she looked at this young officer who represented hope, who represented change. "Thank you, Officer Reyes," Dorothy said. "That means more to me than any settlement ever could. Just promise me something." "Anything, ma'am." "Remember this conversation," Dorothy said. "Remember that every person you meet is someone's mother, someone's child, someone's beloved friend. Remember that the power you have is a responsibility, not a right. And remember that dignity costs nothing to give, but its absence costs everything." Officer Reyes nodded, tears in her own eyes now. "I promise, Mrs. Chambers, I promise." The officer replaced her cap, nodded respectfully to the other ladies at the table, and walked away. Dorothy watched her go, then sat back down and picked up her book. The sun was warm, Muffin was safe. Her friends were around her. And somewhere across town, her son was in his chambers, reviewing cases, continuing the work of justice. Dorothy opened her book and began to read, a small smile on her face. They had thought they could silence an old woman with a small dog. They had forgotten that behind that old woman was a son who had dedicated his life to fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves. They had forgotten that communities are built on connections, and you can't break one thread without the whole tapestry rising up to defend itself. Officer Brennan had learned this lesson in the worst way possible. He had thought he could bully his way through the world, protected by a badge and a corrupt system. But he had forgotten the most fundamental truth about power. Real power doesn't come from a uniform or a weapon or the ability to intimidate. Real power comes from the strength to stand up, to speak out, and to refuse to be broken. Dorothy Chambers had that power. She had always had it. And on that terrible day when a young officer decided to target her, he had awakened something that would not be put back to sleep. Not just in Dorothy, but in an entire community that had been living in fear for too long. The Chambers Community Oversight Initiative continues to this day, protecting vulnerable residents and holding law enforcement accountable. The reforms implemented in Riverside have become a model for other cities. And Dorothy Chambers, that dignified woman who just wanted to have coffee with her book club, has become a symbol of resistance against abuse of power. As for the $2.1 million, Dorothy kept enough to cover her medical expenses and therapy, enough to ensure her retirement was comfortable and her grandson's college was funded. The rest went into a legal defense fund for victims of police misconduct who couldn't afford attorneys. Because that's what Dorothy Chambers had learned in her 40 years of teaching, that knowledge and resources should be shared, that power should be distributed, and that justice delayed is not justice at all. When you hurt someone's mother, you better pray her son isn't a judge. Officer Brennan learned this lesson the hard way. Sergeant Dalton learned this lesson the hard way. The entire city of Riverside learned this lesson the hard way. But it was a lesson that needed learning. Because dignity doesn't come from a uniform. It doesn't come from authority. It doesn't come from the ability to hurt people weaker than yourself. Dignity comes from how you treat people who have no power to hurt you back. And when you violate that principle, when you forget that fundamental truth, karma doesn't just knock on your door, it breaks it down. Officer Brennan thought he was just teaching an old woman about the rules. Instead, she taught him about consequences. And the price of that lesson was measured in years of freedom lost, a family destroyed, a career ended, and a legacy of shame that will follow him for the rest of his life. Dorothy Chambers, meanwhile, will be remembered as the woman who stood up, who fought back, and who transformed her personal trauma into a movement for justice. She will be remembered as the mother who raised a son to fight for what's right. She will be remembered as the retired teacher who gave one final lesson, that bullies, no matter how powerful they seem, can always be held accountable. And somewhere in a federal prison, Officer Kyle Brennan has plenty of time to think about that lesson. Plenty of time to remember the day he grabbed a small dog from an elderly woman's arms and started a chain of events that would destroy his life. Plenty of time to wish he had just walked away, had just let her go to her book club, had just remembered that the people we police are human beings deserving of respect. But wishes don't change the past. Actions have consequences, and justice, when it finally comes, weighs 1,000 tons. If this story of accountability and karma moved you, please give it a like and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another tale of justice served. Drop a comment below telling us what you think. Should Sergeant Dalton have received an even harsher sentence? Should more cities implement civilian oversight boards? Let's keep this conversation going, because these stories matter, and your voice matters. Thank you for watching, and remember, dignity is not given by a badge. It's inherent in the human spirit, and anyone who forgets that lesson will eventually learn it the hard way.